Welcome to my presentation. As a scholar in architecture, I will discuss diversity and inclusion in historical documentation of multicultural architecture education in the United States in a time of pandemic. My presentation is divided into three parts. Firstly, I will elaborate research problem. Secondly, research method and cases. And thirdly, I will discuss my findings and what can be done to establish more effective and productive dialogues between architecture education and the field of archive. And I would like to indicate that my research project is in progress. If anyone would like to contribute it, I would be very glad. So what is the research problem? Although the global pandemic crisis has clearly exposed deep-seated gender, race, ethnicity-based inequalities in architecture education in the United States, and the roots of these inequalities are interlinked with how collective memory and historical documentation practice, its methods and politics have been constructed so far, there is still a big gap in contents and scopes of archives and collections on the subject in the field. And during the pandemic, official statement by Association Collegiate Schools of Architecture on racism, white privilege, and long-standing inequities has clearly expressed the current problem in architecture education on June 3, 2020. In light of this, if you look at National Council of Architectural Registration Board survey in this year, less than 1 in 5 new architects identify as racial and ethnic minority. Nearly 2 in 5 new architects are women. In terms of the problem with long-standing inequities in architecture education, Professor Mary McLeod's sentences in 2004 shed light its historical roots. In the United States today, feminist architecture history, like feminism in general, has nearly disappeared. Few schools continue to offer classes on gender and architecture. And more recently, in 2016, Professor Kenneth Frampton, where Professor of Architecture at Columbia University, emphasized this problem through critical modern architecture history. In trying to expand modern architectural critical history, the big issue is what you include and what you exclude, and what is the criteria for judgment. In order to examine this problem, I will focus on leading archives and collections at pioneering schools of architecture, whose graduate programs were selected among top 10 in the United States in 2018-2019, according to the survey conducted by Design Intelligence. And as you can see, these programs on the slide. I contacted all these programs in 2019, and before this presentation, I also asked all participants if they have an update. In addition to this, the director at the American Institute of Architects, Archives and Records shared information on organizational records at their institutions with an emphasis on diversity and inclusion. Now, if we focus on Harvard University Graduate School of Design, according to their archivist, they do not know a research study on the history of their archive. Although their collections include some pioneering women and foreign-born people in architecture and design fields, they have not specifically asked the question on pioneering profiles from various ethnic groups and from LGBTQ community in the history of their school. And as she indicates, some ethnic groups are represented in their collections. However, I have not received systematic or well-detailed information or data on this subject. In terms of digitization, they have piloted digital initiatives on some well-known architects. And now, if we turn our attention to architecture and design collections at the MIT Museum, according to their creator, there is no research on the history of architecture collections at MIT. However, he has been intending to publish one, but not soon. And there is no mission statement in effect for the collection to uncover, support, and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the history of the MIT architecture. They have an extensive digitization project underway and introduced a collections portal online. In addition to this, following my appointment with the curator in April 2019, then, according to the MIT Museum official page, in August 2019, the MIT Museum and Libraries organized Women of the MIT Wikipedia Hackathon for documenting women to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the MIT architecture. And at Cornell University, according to their written response in 2019, they do not have an archivist or curator specifically attached to architectural and visual documents. They requested my research questions, but no response so far. And if we turn our attention to Yale University Schools of Architecture, according to their archivist, there is no research on the history of their archive, and they do not have systematic or well-detailed information or data on how diverse their historical documentation on the history of their schools. And there is no digital archive project to share their significant historical materials with diverse perspectives. For Princeton University, according to their librarian's written response, the Schools of Architecture was without an archivist as of February 2019, and she is responsible for collection development, scholarly collections, and research services. According to her knowledge, there is no comprehensive written history on their archival collections, and they do not have systematic information on diversity in the history of their schools of architecture, and they do not have digital archive project. At the Rice University Schools of Architecture, their assistant head of spatial collections has no response for a research study on the history of their architecture collections. For systematic information or data on different gender, race, ethnicity in their archives and collections, she could share only a few links from their archive for a few significant architects. For SciArc, they have an archive on video records of their public lectures. And as their library manager elaborates, they have no research on the history of their architectural archive. In terms of archival data, they don't know, but suggested to check back in 2022. And only about 14% of their lecture videos feature women. And they have been working on a special playlist of videos on queer and gender spatial practices. And at the University of Michigan Architecture Program, as their librarian indicates, a book published in 1995 includes some coverage of the history of the collections, but they do not have the data on how diverse their historical documentation practice on the history of their schools of architecture. And for a digital project, she has no response. Finally, for the American Institute of Architects Organizational Records and Archives, according to their director's response, the American Institute of Architects Archives have been supporting several projects on women and underrepresented profiles and communities since the 1980s. However, I could not receive systematic or well-detailed information or data on their organizational records with gender, race, ethnicity of their members in their history. In light of these responses, the existing picture seems to be unclear with the lack of systematic information, data, reports, and surveys. In particular, it is very critical that some pioneering schools of architecture do not have an archivist. On the other hand, it should be underlined that some architecture programs appointed their women head of departments or deans in recent times, such as MIT, Columbia, Princeton, Yale, and Cornell University. I think that it is time to ask how those brilliant and inspiring women academic leaders have contributed to diverse historical documentation practice in their architecture programs. Finally, first of all, in historical documentation practice, all architecture programs should have an archivist or archive team with diverse profiles, and there is strongly need mission statement in effect to develop diverse content and scope in archives and collections with their well-defined methods. There is also strongly need systematic information and data collected regularly, and reports, surveys, and digital archives and collections with diverse and inclusive understanding. In parallel to these efforts, regular meetings, panels, discussion platforms, award programs to bring diverse profiles into fields together with international feminist scholars working on architecture and its education history might have very significant contributions to establish more productive and effective dialogues between two fields for diverse and inclusive historical documentation on architecture education. As a former member of SAA and an Istanbul-born woman architecture scholar, I am ready to take my responsibility to establish this dialogue between two fields for better architecture and for a better world. Thank you for your listening.